Welcome to Week 4 of English 301, Romanticism in American Literature 1820 to 1865. This first slide gives you an opportunity to reflect as much on the literary history of the period between 1820 to 1865 as on the scholarly history that has established this period in the heart and soul of American literature. The term American Renaissance as a label for the antebellum period comes to us from Etho Matheson's monumental work of scholarship, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman, 1941, which canonized Emerson, Hawthorne, Melville, Thoreau, and Whitman as the major figures of 19th century American literature. It's worth remembering that only 1 year before Matheson published his book, another scholar of American literature, Fred Lewis Patee, wrote a book of his own about the period called The Feminine Fifties, in which he dismissed the antebellum period as producing an inconsequential array of literature that he disparagingly characterized as feminine, regardless of whether it was written by men or women. In addition to its arguably sexist bias, Patee's book participated in a long-standing bias against 19th century American literature as less significant, less valuable, and aesthetically less successful than its British counterparts. Matheson's book undid much of the work done by books such as Patee's to denigrate antebellum American literature without, it bears noting, addressing the sexist bias, paving the way for books such as Roy Harvey Pierce's The Continuity of American Poetry, 1961. Scholarly texts such as those by Matheson and Pierce established a number of critical commonplaces about American literature that define literary study for decades, including the idea that American literature is first and foremost a national tradition, defined principally by its relationship to U.S. political and cultural nationalism, and that the focus of American literary history is a handful of great authors who were, more often than not, middle-class white men who were neither the most popular nor the most prolific writers of the period. The major revisions to Matheson's version of the American Renaissance came in form of the multicultural and feminist critiques of the 1970s and 80s, and in the transatlantic and hemispheric critiques of the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. These various efforts to revise and expand the five-man canon of Matheson's American Renaissance have given us a richer and more complete version of the literary production in the United States during the antebellum period. Reviewing the table of contents of Volume B of the Norton Anthology of American Literature can give you an idea of how the canon of American literature has expanded beyond Matheson's initial vision. There has also been an historical critique of Matheson's American Renaissance as scholars have moved back into the 1820s to identify an earlier flowering of American letters preceding Matheson's focus on the 1850s. The first few paragraphs of the American Literary Nationalism and the 1820s section of the introduction to Volume B of the Norton Anthology of American Literature lays out a detailed explanation of how the aftermath of the War of 1812 produced a climate for cultural nationalism that was not only remarkably similar to the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, but that also led to the creation of what could legitimately be called the first Renaissance in American literature. Following the American Revolution, a number of American authors wrote epic national poems such as Timothy Dwight's The Conquest of Canaan, 1785, and Joel Barlow's The Columbiad, 1807. Similarly, the War of 1812 presented writers with a set of circumstances that led to a flowering of nationalist cultural sentiment. Two of the major cultural movements in the War of 1812 were the burning of the Capitol and White House in 1814, which left Americans feeling vulnerable and weak as a national power, and Andrew Jackson's improbable victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, which gave Americans a renewed sense of national pride. Jackson's election as president in 1828 ushered in the era of Jacksonian democracy and canonized the figure of the Republican hero, the anti-aristocratic, anti-monarchical person from an obscure background who incarnated the strengths and virtues of the U.S. nation. The figure of the Republican hero would show up in a variety of literary texts, including James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales and Catherine Maria Sedgwick's Hope Leslie. This figure would reappear in the 1850s in Whitman's poetic persona in Song of Myself and other poems, Thoreau's persona in Walden, and in ironic form in Melville's Bartleby and Moby Dick. Note, readers attuned to 21st century U.S. politics will need to be reminded that the early 19th century meaning of Republican should not be confused with the Republican Party, which was not founded until 1854. To identify oneself as a Republican in the early 19th century meant that, in a broad sense, one was opposed to monarchy and dictatorship and supported the will of the people. One of the most immediate manifestations of cultural nationalism following the War of 1812 involved a transatlantic exchange between British and American journalists over the value of American literature. The most famous soundbite from what is often referred to as the Paper War is Sidney Smith's sarcastic demand from an 1820 issue of the Edinburgh Review, quote, "In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book?" End quote. Prior to Smith's attack, American writers and critics had already issued a call to create a body of American literature that was independent of British and European influence. In an 1815 issue, for instance, the critic Walter Channing urged his countrymen to produce, quote, "a literature of our own," end quote. Similarly, in his 1818 book, An Essay on American Poetry, the critic Solomon Brown asserted that Americans could not claim to have won the War of 1812 until that victory manifested itself in the production of a distinctively American literature. The proudest freedom to which a nation can aspire, not accepting even political independence, is found in complete emancipation from literary thraldom, said Brown. As the Norton Anthology of American Literature introduction points out, however, cultural nationalism was not the same thing as cultural ignorance. American writers took pride in a literature that they regarded as not necessarily as distinct from, but rather in conversation with, English literary traditions. Given the language that the country shared, most American literary nationalists simply hoped that American writers could take their places alongside their British siblings or cousins. Similarly, cultural nationalism did not mean uncritical patriotism. One of the more notable features of the acclaimed 1820s writings of Irving, Bryant, and Cooper, along with the writings of their contemporaries such as Sedgwick, Sigourney, and Lydia Marie Child, was just how critical these writings could be of early national culture. In the wake of the War of 1812, there was a shared belief among the major writers of the time that the United States did have distinct materials with which to develop a distinctive, though not separate, national literature. Authors such as Irving, Cooper, and Bryant placed a special emphasis on the importance of the natural landscape for the development of national character. These writers shared the vision of the popular Hudson River landscape painters of the antebellum period. New Yorkers like Thomas Cole and Asher Durand, who regularly portrayed individuals dwarfed by mountains and forests in a vast and unsettled nature where God's spirit could be apprehended. Paintings such as Asher Brown Durand's Kindred Spirits, 1849, shared the sentiment of American writers who believed that depictions of the American landscape held the key to creating a literary tradition that they did not rely upon British or European models. American landscape artists not only shared a similar philosophy with their literary counterparts, but also often worked with them to create distinctively American cultural expressions. Pictured here is Thomas Cole's Scene from the Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. You should understand that the literary renaissances of the 1820s and 1850s were as dependent upon technology and social developments as they were upon the cultural nationalism that followed the American Revolution and the War of 1812. The section of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Introduction on the Literary Marketplace in an Expanding Nation, lays out the key developments that made it possible for writers to have their works published and disseminated to a growing readership both at home and abroad. One of the first points to consider is how difficult it was for American writers to edge out their British counterparts, not necessarily because British books were better, but because of the lack of an international copyright law, which made it more profitable for U.S. publishers to reprint a successful British book than it was for them to take a risk on an untried American book, the author of which they would then be required to pay royalties. British texts were able to circulate through the increasingly sophisticated distribution network made possible by improved technologies in river and rail transportation. You need to appreciate the irony that the creation of a national reading public increased the popularity of British texts more than American ones. This image of J.W. Hill's View on the Erie Canal, 1829, illustrates how literary publishers in New York City were able to take British books that came to them from across the Atlantic, reprint them, and then distribute them as far west as Ohio on an expanding system of rivers and canals. Here we see a painting titled The Railroad Suspension Bridge near Niagara Falls, 1856 or after. In 1830, there were only 40 miles of railroad in the United States. By 1850, over 8,000 miles of railroad tracks covered the nation. By 1860, the number would climb to almost 29,000. The expanding railroad system complemented river and canal transportation in disseminating texts from publishing centers on the East Coast, principally New York and Philadelphia, to the south and west. The growth of U.S. cities and the ongoing expansion of the nation's territorial reach contributed to one of the most significant developments of the time for those writers aspiring to professional authorship: the dramatic growth of newspaper and magazine publishing. Between 1800 and 1825, approximately 400 newspapers were founded, and that number went into the thousands by 1860. Before 1825, there were approximately 100 magazines published in the United States. By 1850, there were about 600. Readers who have spent their academic lives experiencing literature in books and anthologies will need to understand how important the periodical context was to writers from this period. Periodical publication offered writers both financial support and the opportunity to reach a broader audience. Periodicals also placed limitations on writers, requiring that stories and poems be a certain length and that they fit the expectations of a given periodical's target audience. Godey's Lady Book was one of the most popular periodicals of the period. Many women writers who contributed to Godey's, but male writers such as Edgar Allan Poe contributed as well. Richard Canton's Woodville's War News from Mexico, 1848, is one of the most iconic images of the antebellum period. Depicted here is a group of American citizens reading in their local newspaper about the events transpiring in distant Mexico. The newspaper is at the center of the painting, both literally and figuratively. It creates a white space at the exact midpoint of the painting to which our eyes are drawn, and it illustrates the idea that newspapers could connect Americans from different parts of the country as they read about the same events. Poems and stories published in newspapers had a similar effect as American writers had their works circulated throughout the nation. Emerson declared in Man the Reformer, 1841, that, quote, "the doctrine of reform had never such scope as at the present hour." End quote. Reform movements were an integral part of antebellum culture as Americans of various political stripes sought to make the new nation the best place they believed it could be. Many American writers were either sympathetic to or wholly supportive of these reform movements, and reform themes and images influenced and in some cases defined the literature that they produced. The 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, was one of the most influential meetings of women's rights advocates of the time. Along with feminist activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, men from the abolition movement such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison supported the convention. There is a strong correlation between the antebellum women's rights movement and the preponderance of women writers from the period, whom Hawthorne famously referred to as, quote, "a mob of scribbling women." The rising tide of women's rights also produced a sense of anxiety for men, who feared that increased freedoms for women would result in a radical change in gender roles, as illustrated here in this editorial cartoon depicting strong, confident women heading out into the public sphere as men are left at home to tend domestic affairs. This sense of masculine anxiety manifests itself in works such as Melville's Moby Dick and Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Just as the debate over slavery would define the politics of the antebellum period, ultimately becoming one of the principal causes of the Civil War, so too did slavery influence the literature of the period. From Emerson and Thoreau's essays about the radical abolitionist John Brown to slave narrative novels by African Americans such as Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, and Harriet Jacobs, to images of slavery in the poetry of Walt Whitman, it is difficult to overstate how profoundly the issue of slavery affected the writers of this period. The most famous book about slavery from the period was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. Stowe's novel was so successful that the only book that sold more copies throughout the entire 19th century was the Bible. Abraham Lincoln directly credited Uncle Tom's Cabin with raising the stakes in the debate over slavery when he described Stowe as, quote, the little lady who started this great war. Native Americans had been appearing in American literature for many years, but the debate over the Indian Removal Act of 1830 made the question of Native American sovereignty in the United States a more pressing matter than it had ever been before. Anglo-American writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Lydia Maria Child directly attacked the U.S. policies to forcibly remove Native peoples from the nation's boundaries and relocate them west of the Mississippi River. And Native American writers and orators such as Elias Boudinot, William Apess, and Black Hawk, pictured here, also eloquently defended their people's rights to sovereignty. Native American themes and images show up throughout the literature of the period. In Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, 1826, Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, 1827, The Poetry of Whitman, and Melville's Moby Dick, 1851. You may not fully appreciate how much the writers in Volume B of this anthology interacted with each other. The Norton Anthology of American Literature, Introduction to the Antebellum Period, describes in great length the degree to which these authors knew one another, read one another's works, and produced their own writings as part of a large and ongoing conversation with one another. In addition to the small world of American writers described in the previous slide, the large world of American writers encompassed many of the major figures from this period, not only living abroad but at home. American writers also read extensively from the works of British and European authors. As the introduction points out, a glance at the footnotes of this volume will reveal the enormous influence of classics from ancient Greece and Rome, Greek and Roman myth, Indian and Asian religions, which is especially true for Thoreau, the English Renaissance, especially Shakespeare, Milton, English and German romantics, the Bible, and a range of popular and classic literature from Scandinavian and numerous other countries. We began this presentation by acquainting ourselves with an American Renaissance that took place in the antebellum period. While the earlier slides of this presentation focused on understanding what this Renaissance entailed, we may end this exploration appropriately by remembering the degree to which this was an American Renaissance rather than part of an ongoing transatlantic, and as the Norton Anthology of American Literature introduction points out, hemispheric conversation about literature and culture. This concludes this week's video lecture. If you have questions about any of its contents and/or the corresponding text and context, please contact your instructor and/or consult Norton's Study Space site.